Welcome, friends, to another edition of the Economic Lens, where we take a deeper look behind the headlines that move markets, jobs, and alliances. I'm glad you're here. Before we begin, a brief announcement. Next week, we'll have a segment on the myth of cheap chips, how subsidies rewired global manufacturing. And later this month, I'll be speaking at the Global Policy Forum on a panel titled Allies, Sanctions, and the Price of Loyalty. So stay tuned. Now, let's move to today's story, one that might sound small, even technical, but carries the weight of an entire regional balance. The U.S. has floated the idea of a reciprocal tariff of 20% on imports from Taiwan. The logic, at least on paper, is simple. If a country taxes American goods, America will tax theirs at the same rate. Fair, right? But as with so many things in economics, what sounds fair in a soundbite can become destructive in practice. Taiwan is not just another trading partner. It is the world's largest producer of advanced semiconductors, the very chips that run everything from iPhones to missiles. A quarter of America's electronic supply chain touches Taiwan in some way through materials, subassemblies, or final testing. To hit that link with tariffs is to throw sand into the gears of your own machine, yet that's what's being proposed under the banner of fair trade. Before jumping in, let's remember what reciprocal really means in this context. It's not a simple balancing act. It's a political message. It tells domestic voters we're tough. We're defending American workers. But the deeper reality is that these measures rarely hurt the targeted country as much as they unsettle the networks of trust that make trade possible. In this case, the very networks that Washington claims it needs to counter Beijing's growing economic and technological influence. The irony could not be sharper. The United States, while urging allies to stand together against China's coercive trade practices, is now testing a similar logic on one of those very allies. Taiwan, a democracy under constant pressure, is being told to share the pain of American politics. The tariff proposal, even if symbolic, plants doubt in the minds of Taiwanese producers and investors. If Washington can weaponize tariffs against friends, what certainty do they have tomorrow? Let's bring this down to the ground. Imagine a small printed circuit board plant in Heishinshu. Workers on the night shift try to meet deadlines for an American client. Orders have been steady, if not growing, since pandemic shortages forced firms to diversify away from mainland China. But last night, the factory manager received a short email from the U.S. buyer, just 3 words: awaiting policy decision. The machines keep humming, but the sense of urgency has turned into anxiety. That, friends, is how macro policy becomes micro paralysis. We've seen this pattern before. In 2018, during the first trade war with China, many American importers began pulling supply from Taiwan and South Korea to avoid Chinese tariffs. It worked temporarily, but by 2020, the ripple effect caught up: higher costs, delivery delays, and eroded trust. History is now threatening to repeat itself, this time directed at a partner that has long aligned its economy with American standards and strategic goals. Here's what that means. A reciprocal tariff is not reciprocal at all when the two economies stand in asymmetrical positions. Taiwan's market depends on exports, America's depends on imports. The U.S. can threaten access, but it also relies on that same access for its own production lines. That's not reciprocity, that's self-inflicted leverage. The proposal, first mentioned in a Bloomberg interview by a senior trade advisor close to the Trump campaign, was likely meant as a trial balloon a message to show strength ahead of negotiations. Yet even a trial balloon can alter expectations. Taiwan's small and medium enterprises, the backbone of its export economy, don't plan in campaign cycles. They plan in quarters, years, sometimes decades. When policy becomes theater, investment freezes. In other words, what's being sold as a bold economic strategy is in practice an act of self-sabotage. It weakens trust, it chills contracts, and it signals to rivals, especially Beijing, that the U.S. alliance system can fracture under domestic populism. When allies begin to doubt the steadiness of American policy, they don't protest, they hedge, they look elsewhere. That's when influence slips quietly, not through war or diplomacy, but through fatigue. As we open this episode, let's ask the first and simplest question. Who benefits when an ally's economy stumbles? And who loses when supply chains that took decades to build are suddenly thrown into political limbo? The answers will tell us more about power, dependence, and the price of inconsistency than any campaign slogan ever could. Let's begin by tracing the logic or the illusion behind what's called reciprocal tariffs. The phrase itself sounds clean, mathematical. If they tax us, we tax them. But economics, unlike arithmetic, operates in systems, not equations. Tariffs are not mirror images, they're levers. And when you pull one, it moves not just prices, but confidence, logistics, and geopolitics. The reciprocal tariff idea isn't new. It reemerged during the first Trump administration, buried in a 2019 memo drafted under the Section 301 authority. It never gained traction then because the State Department and the Pentagon both warned quietly that applying it to friendly economies could unravel supply chains crucial to national security. Fast forward to today, and that caution seems forgotten. Taiwan's export structure is heavily intertwined with U.S. technology and capital. Nearly 40% of its manufacturing output relies on semiconductor-related components, most of which flow to American clients or subsidiaries. On the other hand, the United States imports roughly $24 billion in electronics and components from Taiwan each year, a figure that barely covers the demand of its own high-tech industries. Introducing a 20% tariff would therefore raise costs across U.S. production lines, from smartphones to defense avionics. It's like taxing your own bloodstream. But beyond cost, there's the strategic contradiction. For years, Washington has pushed its allies to decouple from China, citing security risks, forced technology transfers, and supply chain overexposure. Companies in Taiwan and Japan, responding to that pressure, began to shift facilities toward the U.S. or its partners. They did so under the assumption that alliances meant stability. Now they're watching as Washington turns the tariff gun toward them, the very allies who complied. Don't be fooled by the rhetoric of fair trade. What's being dressed up as fairness is, in reality, domestic theater. It's a way to channel frustration, the pain of inflation, of offshore jobs, of stagnant wages toward a symbolic foreign villain. Politically, it works. Economically, it corrodes the very foundation it claims to protect. Let's recall a historical parallel. In the 1,930 seconds, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised U.S. duties on thousands of goods, intending to shield farmers and manufacturers during the Depression. The result, retaliation from 25 countries, including Canada and major European partners. Within a year, global trade fell by 2/3. It didn't just hurt foreign producers, it deepened the American collapse. Today's version is less dramatic in scale, but no less short-sighted in spirit. Here's a revealing data point. According to the Taiwan External Trade Development Council, more than 70% of its small and medium-sized exporters say they have no capacity to absorb tariff shocks beyond 10%. They operate on razor-thin margins, often supplying U.S. mid-tier firms that in turn supply giants like Apple or Lockheed Martin. When tariffs hit, these smaller players can't simply pass on costs. They fold, relocate, or shift toward other markets. Guess which one waits with open arms? China. That's the bitter irony. By imposing a punitive tariff under the banner of America First, the U.S. might actually accelerate the very dependence on Beijing it wants to avoid. Because supply chains don't disappear, they reroute. A Taiwanese parts maker priced out of U.S. markets will find a buyer in Shenzhen or Suzhou within weeks. Beijing won't even need to lift a finger. It will just collect the fallout. Let's not forget the human side. Those night shifts in Hatsinchu, the engineers juggling production lines while investors delay payments, they're not geopolitical actors. They're workers caught between superpowers. Their emails, invoices, and customs forms have become the collateral of policy gestures meant to impress cable news audiences thousands of miles away. And on the U.S. side, the story isn't much better. Many American SMEs, small manufacturers in Texas, Illinois, and California, depend on Taiwanese inputs to maintain their own delivery schedules. When tariffs hit, they don't gain jobs, they lose contracts. They don't rehire, they postpone expansion. We've seen this before. Every reciprocal tariff ends up being a reciprocal wound. Now, let's move to a subtler layer in the psychological effect. Taiwan's government has been carefully balancing between deterrence and reassurance. Every signal from Washington matters. A hint of tariff hostility, even unimplemented, tells Taipei you're a partner of convenience, not principle. That doubt, once seated, is hard to erase. It echoes through boardrooms, policy circles, and even the cultural imagination. Meanwhile, in Beijing, this kind of message is gold. Chinese state media can now argue that the U.S. treats all partners as expendable, that America first really means allies last. Propaganda doesn't need to invent, it just needs to quote. The U.S. may not realize it, but a tariff debate in Washington is also a morale test in Taipei. It's a test of who truly counts as an ally and who counts as a bargaining chip. And at this moment, that distinction is blurring to America's detriment. Now let's turn to what this tariff drama truly exposes, not just a policy mistake, but a deeper insecurity running through Washington's economic strategy. Every few years, the same script repeats. A foreign partner outcompetes a U.S. sector, domestic anger rises, and the political class responds by rediscovering tariffs as a patriotic cure. The irony is that it rarely cures anything. It merely transfers blame, deflecting attention from decades of underinvestment in manufacturing, infrastructure, and education. Let's be clear. The issue isn't whether Taiwan treats America unfairly. It doesn't. Taiwan already has some of the lowest import barriers for U.S. goods in Asia. Its tariffs on industrial equipment average below 2%, and many categories are duty-free under the Trade and Investment Framework Agreement signed years ago. So why this sudden zeal for a reciprocal tax? The answer lies not in economics, but optics. A 20% tariff looks like action, it photographs well, it sounds like toughness, and in a campaign year, image often outweighs consequence. But here's the cost of that image. Over the last decade, Taiwan has become one of America's quietest success stories in economic diplomacy. While others hesitated, Taipei aligned its labor laws, IP protections, and export standards to match U.S. demands. It became a reliable partner in reshoring chip packaging and testing sectors America desperately needs to rebuild if it wants to compete with China's industrial scale. A tariff on Taiwanese imports doesn't punish bad behavior, it punishes compliance. There's a term economists use, credibility premium. It describes the trust investors place in a country that honors its commitments. When the U.S. breaks that trust, even slightly, the cost of rebuilding it is enormous. Remember the steel tariffs of 2018? Within months, allies from Canada to South Korea demanded exemptions, filed complaints at the WTO, and quietly questioned whether American promises meant anything long term. Eventually, many just adapted by selling less to the U.S. and more to others. Credibility, once dented, rarely recovers at the same price. Let's not underestimate how fragile this credibility has become. Since 2022, the Biden administration and now Trump's circle of advisors again have both oscillated between friendshoring and America first. The language shifts, but the logic doesn't. Each policy rebrands protectionism as security, yet the rest of the world hears a simpler message. America's loyalty is conditional, its partnership transactional. For allies like Taiwan, that uncertainty is lethal. Consider how China interprets this moment. Beijing has long sought to drive wedges between the U.S. and its regional allies. A tariff threat from Washington hands them exactly that wedge wrapped in official rhetoric. Chinese trade negotiators can now whisper to Southeast Asian and Pacific partners, see, you can't rely on Washington either. And those whispers, amplified by real trade data, carry weight. In 2024 alone, Taiwan's exports to Southeast Asia grew 15% compared to less than 3% growth to the U.S. That's not ideology, that's insurance. By the way, there's another layer here, the supply chain domino effect. When a U.S. importer faces a 20% tariff on a Taiwanese chip component, it doesn't simply pay more, it rewrites its sourcing plan. Maybe it moves to Malaysia or Vietnam, where Chinese intermediaries already dominate logistics. Slowly, invisibly, supply chains drift back toward the gravitational pull of Chinese production. The more Washington tries to isolate Beijing, the more the region rearranges itself around Beijing's stability. This is what economists call the paradox of coercive trade policy. Meanwhile, in America, the real economy, small tech assemblers, repair shops, startups, feels the pain. They can't easily swap suppliers or absorb costs. A single delayed component can hold up an entire product line. And when that happens, jobs don't come home, they vanish. That's the dirty secret of reciprocal tariffs. They make headlines before elections, but layoffs after. Let's not romanticize Taiwan's role either. It's not charity, it's interdependence. The island's firms profit from U.S. demand, just as the U.S. profits from their innovation. But healthy interdependence requires predictability. A tariff regime that fluctuates with political moods destroys that balance. It turns allies into risk factors, contracts into gambles. So, here's the bigger picture. When America signals that even trusted partners are potential targets of economic punishment, it doesn't project strength. It projects insecurity, the insecurity of a nation unwilling to fix its internal economic weaknesses, so it lashes outward. It's easier to draft a tariff list than to rebuild an education system that trains engineers. It's simpler to threaten foreign producers than to reform domestic monopolies that suppress wages. That's why this story matters, because it's not just about Taiwan. It's about how a superpower handles decline, whether it doubles down on cooperation or collapses inward under the illusion of control. The reciprocal tariff is less a trade measure than a mirror reflecting the fragility of America's economic confidence. And that fragility, friends, is something no tariff can hide. Now let's move to the regional consequences, the silent shifts that don't make front page news but shape the next decade of power in the Pacific. A tariff on Taiwan may look like a bilateral skirmish, yet in practice it reverberates through every corridor of Asia's production network. Think about it. Modern electronics manufacturing doesn't exist in isolation. A single semiconductor device can cross borders 20 or 30 times before reaching a final product. Silicon wafers fabricated in Hsinchu may be polished in Osaka, packaged in Penang, and tested in California. A 20% tariff on one link doesn't stay confined to that link. It ripples outward, raising costs, forcing rerouting, and ultimately discouraging cross-border coordination. It's the equivalent of taxing the bloodstream that connects allies. And when the bloodstream clogs, others step in. Already, trade analysts in Tokyo and Seoul have warned that such U.S. tariffs would accelerate intra-Asian integration, that is, push regional economies to deepen ties with each other instead of with Washington. The result, a trade zone where the U.S. becomes a secondary player, its friend-shoring rhetoric replaced by a reality of self-exclusion. Let's remember, in geopolitics, loyalty follows opportunity. If America shrinks its economic engagement while China expands its credit lines and infrastructure diplomacy, the gravitational field shifts. A Taiwanese supplier may prefer democratic alignment, but its balance sheet doesn't vote, its cash flow does. If Beijing offers stability and the U.S. offers volatility, the market will drift toward predictability, even if it's authoritarian. That's how economic gravity works. The irony here is staggering. For years, Washington has warned of Beijing's attempts to peel away U.S. allies through trade and finance. Yet, by making its own trade unpredictable, Washington is doing Beijing's work for it. Chinese officials don't need to offer subsidies. They just need to wait for allies to grow tired of uncertainty. Patience, not propaganda, becomes the most effective strategy. Let's ground this in numbers. According to the Asian Development Bank, cross-strait electronics trade accounts for roughly 14% of Asia's total tech exports. If U.S. tariffs cut that flow by even a quarter, it could shave 0.3% off Taiwan's GDP and increase average lead times for American chip imports by 2 months. 2 months may not sound catastrophic, but in the world of semiconductor production, where design cycles move in weeks, it's an eternity. That's when competitors seize contracts, investors hedge, and innovation slows. We also need to examine how this affects smaller economies that depend on the same supply chains, countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Many of them are now part of Washington's Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the so-called IPE. They were told that joining this trusted network would bring stability, but what happens when the anchor of that network starts sanctioning its own partners? Confidence erodes. And in international economics, confidence is currency. Meanwhile, at home, U.S. political rhetoric remains disconnected from industrial reality. Candidates boast about bringing manufacturing back, while the Commerce Department quietly reports rising import dependency for intermediate goods. Tariffs don't fix that. They disguise it. Domestic firms, unable to find alternatives, either pass costs to consumers or reduce output. Inflation ticks up. Workers don't see new factories. They see higher prices at Walmart. Yet somehow the blame keeps landing abroad. This tells us something fundamental. America's trade debates are no longer about economics. They're about identity, about performing strength in a moment of insecurity. Reciprocal tariff is the perfect slogan for that purpose. It sounds fair, nationalist, assertive. It transforms structural weakness into a narrative of moral outrage. But outrage, as history teaches, is a poor substitute for strategy. Let's take a moment to reflect on Taiwan's perspective. For decades, Taipei has walked the tightrope of dependence economically tied to both the US and China, yet politically aligned with the West. Its resilience has been admired precisely because it learned to trust that its democratic partners would treat it differently than its authoritarian neighbor. But tariffs erase that distinction. They reduce all relationships to transactions, all alliances to temporary deals, and when everything becomes transactional, nothing remains trustworthy. We shouldn't underestimate how demoralizing that feels in Taipei's political class. Imagine being told to harden against China, diversify exports, and rely on the United States for support, only to see Washington's next move target your own industries. That's not just economic pain, it's strategic confusion. It tells every policymaker in the region that America's loyalty can be measured in polling cycles. And that confusion, friends, is contagious. Already, Japanese and South Korean analysts are debating whether their own industries might be next in line for reciprocal adjustments. The message is spreading. If Taiwan isn't safe from tariff politics, who is? The more allies ask that question, the weaker the coalition becomes. Let's now pull back from the policy details and look at the system behind them, the machinery of American trade politics, where slogans substitute for planning and reciprocity becomes a weapon of domestic theater. Every few years, a new administration rediscovers tariffs as a form of moral accounting. They promise to balance the ledger between America and everyone else, but trade isn't a ledger. It's a web-dense, fragile, and shaped by power, not fairness. In this web, Taiwan plays an outsized role. It's not a cheap exporter, it's a keystone node. Without its high-end chips, U.S. innovation stalls. Without its mid-tier components, the Made in America label loses substance. So when Washington threatens Taipei with tariffs, it's not disciplining a rival, it's shaking the pillar that holds up its own technological ambitions. In the short term, that might win applause on the campaign trail. In the long term, it weakens the foundation beneath the applause. Here's what's often missed in mainstream coverage. Tariffs aren't just about prices, they're about predictability. Investors can handle higher costs if those costs are stable. What they can't handle is uncertainty, the possibility that policy shifts overnight. That's why markets often react more violently to rumors of tariffs than to the tariffs themselves. A single headline can erase millions in planned investment. Bloomberg's leak of the 20% reciprocal tariff did exactly that. Within 48 hours, semiconductor suppliers in Taipei reported clients postponing orders until further clarification. One rumor, and suddenly months of production schedules dissolved into hesitation. That's the real cost. Paralysis. Not dramatic collapse, but a slow, grinding pause across the chain. Factories wait, buyers wait, and competitors, often in mainland China, fill the silence. The fictional Hsinchu plant we mentioned earlier isn't a fantasy. It's a mirror of hundreds of real firms that live on timing. In the electronics world, delay equals loss. When an American customer writes a waiting policy, that's not bureaucracy, it's an economic wound. Now, let's talk politics. Why would any serious policymaker propose such a measure knowing its self-defeating consequences? The answer lies in what we might call the illusion of leverage. American politics has convinced itself that because the U.S. remains the largest consumer market on earth, it can dictate terms unilaterally. That logic worked in 1950 when industrial power and global finance both centered in New York. It barely worked in 1990. It fails outright in 2025. The world has diversified its demand, its currencies, and its technology base. When Washington reaches for the old tools, the world no longer flinches. Consider this. 20 years ago, a U.S. tariff threat could sink a foreign stock exchange overnight. Today, it moves markets for a few hours, then Asia's trading resumes. Global production has adapted to American volatility. Tariffs now hit U.S. consumers harder than they punish foreign exporters. That's why the reciprocal frame is so misleading. Reciprocity assumes equal vulnerability, but Taiwan's vulnerability is asymmetric. It depends on access, while America depends on flow. One needs open doors, the other needs open arteries. Close either, and the global economy suffers. By the way, this obsession with reciprocity has an ideological purpose. It reframes structural decline as betrayal. It tells voters you're suffering because others cheated you, rather than you're suffering because your system stopped investing in you. It transforms a domestic failure, stagnant wages, financialization, decaying infrastructure into an external drama. Taiwan becomes a prop in that drama, a symbol of the foreign taker. The fact that it's an ally, a democracy, and a critical technology partner becomes irrelevant. What matters is emotional clarity, not empirical truth. This is how protectionism morphs into populism. It sells revenge as reform. It turns economic frustration into political capital. And it hides the deeper question. Why does the wealthiest nation in history keep finding new enemies instead of fixing its own productivity? Let's not forget that tariffs are easy to announce but hard to reverse. They create constituencies, lobbyists, bureaucrats, and media cycles that depend on their continuation. Once imposed, they linger. And as they linger, they distort. American firms begin lobbying for exceptions, pleading to be spared from their own government's policy. Allies file petitions. Negotiators trade exemptions like favors. What began as a principled tariff quickly devolves into a marketplace of exceptions corruption by another name. Meanwhile, Beijing watches with calm precision. Every time Washington alienates an ally, China adds another layer to its regional strategy. Its diplomats quietly approach Taiwanese suppliers, offering joint ventures, tax incentives, or currency swaps. It doesn't need to coerce, it just needs to be consistent. That's the new form of influence, not conquest, but patience. So when the U.S. proposes a reciprocal tariff, the true reciprocity may not be economic, but geopolitical. Each act of short-term toughness reciprocates in long-term weakness. Each tariff meant to defend America's autonomy deepens its dependence on rivals' stability. In the end, the arithmetic of fairness becomes the geometry of decline. Now let's bring this discussion into the moral and strategic dimension, because what's unfolding here isn't only a trade dispute, it's a test of what kind of leadership the United States wants to embody in an era of multipolar uncertainty. For decades, American diplomacy relied on a simple equation: alliances built on trust, markets built on openness, and a belief, sometimes naive but powerful, that free exchange served freedom itself. That equation is breaking down. The reciprocal tariff idea captures that breakdown perfectly. It replaces partnership with suspicion, turns cooperation into transaction, and treats trust as a liability rather than an asset. Let's be honest. Every empire in history reaches a moment when it confuses dominance with isolation. The Soviet Union did so in the 1970 seconds when it demanded loyalty over efficiency from its satellite economies. Both paid the price not through invasion, but through exhaustion. The United States now risks repeating that arc, this time in the language of reciprocity. Think about what this signal says to the rest of the world. To Europe, you could be next. To Japan and South Korea, your supply chains are safe only until the next election. To emerging partners like Vietnam or India, America's handshake comes with an asterisk. And to Taiwan, that small, precarious democracy, it says, your sacrifice for alignment may not be rewarded, it may be punished. This tells us something profound about how power erodes quietly through mixed messages. It's not the withdrawal of troops or the fall of a currency that signals decline, it's the erosion of credibility. When allies no longer believe your word, when cooperation becomes a negotiation of threats, the architecture of influence collapses from within. Let's go back to the fictional but all too real factory in Hsinchu. The manager walks through the humming aisles, past workers in clean suits, soldering microscopic connections. The orders from America used to arrive like clockwork. Now, they come with question marks. Wait for the policy, the customer says. We're assessing exposure. That single sentence carries the weight of a geopolitical drift. Those workers aren't economists. They don't read trade memoranda, but they can feel the tremor of hesitation in the global economy, and it translates into shorter contracts, unpaid overtime, fewer new hires. This is how macro politics becomes kitchen table anxiety. Meanwhile, in Washington, the debate is framed as a moral crusade, defending American workers from unfairness. But here's the contradiction. The same politicians who promote reciprocity have spent decades supporting corporate tax cuts, deregulation, and outsourcing policies that hollowed out the very industries they now claim to protect. The tariff becomes a rhetorical band-aid, an emotional substitute for a manufacturing policy that no longer exists. Don't be fooled by the slogans. This isn't about fairness, it's about deflection. A tariff on Taiwan will not reopen a single American factory in Ohio or Pennsylvania. It will, however, raise the cost of every device that relies on a Taiwanese chip, from the smartphone in your pocket to the missile guidance system the Pentagon depends on. In other words, the tariff is a tax not on Taiwan, but on America's own complexity. Let's remember how we got here. Over the past 40 years, the U.S. chose financialization over production. Capital flowed into speculation instead of infrastructure, into buybacks instead of factories. The semiconductor supply chain that now seems like a national security vulnerability didn't appear by accident. It was designed that way to maximize corporate profit. And now When that design shows its cracks, the response is not introspection, but projection. Blame the foreigner. Demand reciprocity. It's the oldest play in the populist handbook. But the world has changed. You cannot tariff your way out of interdependence. You cannot rebuild trust through coercion. What's needed is not revenge disguised as fairness, but strategy grounded in self-awareness. True strength comes not from punishing partners, but from proving reliability. That's what made America powerful after World War II, the capacity to lead through confidence, not through fear. Today, that confidence is waning. You can see it in the policy oscillations, in the nervous language of reshoring and decoupling, in the reflexive need to frame every trade imbalance as an existential threat. This is not economic leadership, it's economic anxiety. And anxiety, when politicized, becomes dangerous. It breeds policies that punish friends more quickly than foes. Now, here's the cruel paradox. Every time the U.S. imposes a reciprocal tariff on an ally, it validates China's narrative that American alliances are inherently self-serving. That narrative gains traction not because it's persuasive, but because Washington keeps proving it true. In Beijing's state-run media, the headlines almost write themselves. Taiwan learns the cost of trusting America. That's not propaganda, that's marketing delivered courtesy of American inconsistency.